Has mainstream evangelical theology been getting its very doctrine of God himself wrong? And what impact does that have on missions? Buckle up. Dr. James Dolezal is here to dive deep into the doctrine of God on today's show. But first, let me tell you about Daniel. Daniel fled his home in Peru when he was 12 years old after his drunken father threatened to kill him. Daniel became an alcoholic like his father. One day, he ended up at a local church. But as a Roman Catholic from his upbringing, Daniel resisted the evangelical gospel that he heard and vowed to disprove Christianity itself. Well, that didn't last long. Daniel was converted, and he developed a passion to share the gospel with the lost. That's when ABWE missionary Steve Douglas noticed and began discipling him for 9 years. Today, Daniel has founded a seminary in his city of Arequipa, and he's planted 15 churches of his own. Daniel's special, but he's not unique. We're finding partners like these all over the world. And in this changing global climate, we can continue to do greater things for the Great Commission by partnering with people on the field, already risking all to make disciples. Your gift to the Global Gospel Fund can impact 1,000 missionaries working in more than 70 nations. Become a partner now. Go to abwe.org/globalgospelfund20. That's abwe.org/globalgospelfund20.
Have you ever been approached by a student expressing a missionary call? For the last 15 years, Spurgeon College's Fusion program has been equipping students for missions through life-on-life discipleship, college coursework, and intensely practical training. If you know a student desiring to become a missionary, send them to Fusion at Spurgeon College as their next step. To learn more about how we are equipping students for a lifetime, visit spurgeoncollege.com/fusion.
Welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kochman, Director of Advancement and Communications with ABWE, joined again, as always, by my good friend Scott Dunford, West Coast Advancement Coordinator and lead church planter, Redeemer Church in Fremont, California. And Scott, we began the episode with a big question. Are missionaries getting their very doctrine of God himself wrong? Man, it's quite the accusation to throw out there. So can I unravel that for a second? Will you
I think
that?
You need to, because probably our missionaries are like, maybe Alex, you're wrong.
I might be. It wouldn't be the first time, as you well know, Scott. But one of my fondest memories from when I first started working at ABWE under you, and we do some traveling together here and there. We both became involved in the doctrinal interview process for our new missionaries. So for those of you coming to us outside the ABWE family, one of the first steps towards becoming an ABWE missionary, regardless of your role, if you're serving in a long-term career missionary capacity, is a doctrinal interview it's kind of like an ordination exam. Maybe not as intense, definitely not as intense. It's a friendly environment, but we do still go deep into some things. And one of the questions that we start, we walk through each classical category of systematic theology, and we just start with who is God? Or this is one of the first questions that we ask, who is God, or what is God? And you've probably seen this happen a number of times. I have too. When we start with that question, the answers that we get are good, and they're true, and they're biblical. Answers like, well, God is love. God is our Redeemer. He's our Lord. He's our Savior. He is creator, provider, sustainer. He's our rock, right? And you can multiply the examples, man, and you just want to shout and scream amen with all these things or all these pronouncements. But to me, personally, they're all kind of skipping over some foundational things there. A lot of those things are things that God does, but they don't address what God is or who God is. We're not building on that foundation there yet, which may seem like begging the question a little bit, but I'm convinced that if we don't get who God is correct, that we're going to be at a massive disadvantage as we go out and try to tell people in other cultures and languages who exactly this God is. So,
Right.
Scott, why don't you introduce our guest for us? We have a guest who is passionate about this very topic.
Passionate and has spent a lot of time thinking about it, and we're excited to pick his brain. So we have Dr. James Dolezal. Hopefully I'm saying this right. You can correct me, James.
Scott, that sounds right to me.
If that sounds right to you, then we're going to go with it. He's the associate professor at Cairn University, School of Divinity in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, teaching church history, Trinitarian theology, and philosophy. And he's been at Cairn since 2013. He did his education at Master's College and Seminary, and then at Westminster Theological Seminary, where he finished his THM and PhD, and is author of two books, God Without Parts and All That Is in God. So I feel like you are equipped as in a great way to address some of these questions with us. So let's just dive in, and as we go along, we'll get to know you a little bit more. But start with the question of which I'm sure a lot of our listeners are asking: what is divine simplicity, and why does that matter?
That's a great question. And sort of ironically, the answer isn't simple, but I will try to get out of this, because when we hear that God is simple, first of all, we don't hear that much, though I think we're starting to hear that more and more as a kind of older theology is reasserting itself. I think that's a good thing. I remember coming across this in the Second London Confession, that God is without parts. And I that sounded right, because I didn't believe God had a body. And so, of course, he didn't have body parts. But the confession means a little bit more than that. So let me sort of get into what historically Christians meant when they said God is simple. Not simple not easy to understand, not comprehensible, not simplistic in our modern way of saying those sorts of things. This is in no way an insult. What we really mean is that God is most absolute and fundamental in being, and that there's nothing that God is, you can almost think of this as God's irreducibleness, so that if a thing is composed of parts, it is reducible to parts, not identical to itself. And I know that sounds a bit technical, but I can just use take a Toyota Corolla, for instance. A Toyota Corolla is not a most basic entity when it comes to the car. There are steering columns and wheels and drive shafts and fuel injectors and all the other things, none of which is a Toyota Corolla, that sort of goes into the composition of the car. So that the vehicle is, because it's composed of parts, it is a dependent entity. It depends upon features of being more fundamental than itself.
Right.
And really what we're saying when we say God is simple is that he does not depend upon bits of this or that or the other, whether those are physical or metaphysical. He does not depend on what is not himself in order to be or to be himself. So it's really that irreducibleness of God. And I think most Christians, whether they've ever heard of simplicity or not, if they believe in the God of the Bible, they already believe in this absolute fundamentality, this basicality of divine being, the being behind which there is nothing, the being that is most absolute. Simplicity is just a way of defending that conviction.
So when you say it that way, it sounds like this is something that, of course, like every Christian would believe or should believe. And yet, if you Google divine simplicity, you find a lot of articles and comments about the fact that this is kind of somewhat controversial, at least as far as I understand. Why would anything that you're saying be controversial to Christians?
That's a good question. I think in part because of the way that we do theology, and I'm not saying this is a bad thing, it's just an inevitable part of our human finitude. The way we do theology is, as it were, bit by bit. And even the way we talk about God is bit by bit. And for instance, I use many different non-synonymous terms to describe God. You gave some of those in your introduction, answers that are given during a theological question. God is good and wise and loving and just, true, eternal, powerful. Those are just a few. And those terms, when I say them, are not synonymous terms. And so if I can put it like this, my God talk is necessarily multi-parted. I have a subject, God, and then I have a plurality of predicates, good, wise, loving, just, true, and eternal. And what becomes easy to do is to read off of the manner of my God talk, which is multi-parted. I say God, and then I say many other things beside: good, wise, loving, just, and true. And it's easy to think that this way of speaking is in fact a kind of direct map to God's way of being. So that if my God talk is multi-parted, it must be because he himself is multi-parted. I think that's at least maybe one reason why modern theologians or Christians generally think that God must be composed of parts. I think there's another, that's the more linguistic answer. Right. There's another one, which is, it has to do with our notion of power. So that things that are, if you can think of a thing that is meant to produce an outcome, like let's just take a vehicle of transportation, and I can take a BMX bicycle and a Boeing 747. Both of these are designed as vehicles of transportation. One of them is, in fact, much more effective at transporting 300 people at a time with air conditioning at 700 miles an hour, 40,000 feet in the air, and serve you ginger ale with ice. You know what I'm saying? Like this is and I have to think that the 6 million parts of that Boeing 7, I think that's right, roughly 6 million parts of that Boeing 747, each contributes something to that greater power and efficacy that it has. And conversely, and sort of correspondingly, the far fewer parts of my BMX explain the fact that I don't have air conditioning or ginger ale served to me, or a bathroom on board. So that we are used to thinking of things that have fewer parts as also being less powerful to act or to operate. And so then when we think about a product like the world, the heavens, the earth, the sea and dry land, and all that is therein, and we think about what must it take for a causal agent to be able to produce an outcome of such variety and magnitude, he must be the most complex, the most multi-parted entity, because that's what we're used to in physics. In physics, the more parts, the more power. Right. Well, if you need omnipotence to produce a world, then you've got to have like super multi-partedness. And I think that kind of that way of thinking in physics, particularly in the modern age, the last 300 years, the way of thinking in physics sort of dominates our expectations about reality. We think, well, when it comes to physics or chemistry, the more parts, the more power. It must be that way when it comes to divine creation as well. Ergo, God must be super multi-parted or something like that. So that would be another reason why modern Christians might be inclined to say God has parts, and perhaps many of them, and he's super complex.
Well, I think maybe like a Sunday school kind of question that I've heard talked about many times, right? Is God's justice, comparing God's justice and God's love, and
sure,
if those are two different parts that are somehow competing. What I'm hearing you saying, like, that is part of the problem if we view things that way. Am I right?
It does. Yeah, it runs the risk of potentially placing divine attributes in competition with each other. Some who deny simplicity have overcome that by simply positing a sort of divine harmoniousness where all the parts just sync up just right and work in tandem with each other, which is really not divine simplicity, but it's divine complexity with a high level of harmony. And I think what we have to say, going back to like the illustration of the bicycle and the airplane, the problem with multi-partedness is really the problem of dependency. So that like a BMX, for instance, depends upon a bike chain and spokes and a frame and handlebars and handlebar grips and a seat. And none of those things I just named are a BMX bike. Right. And you could say the same thing about a Boeing 747. It needs wing flaps, and it needs landing gear, and it needs, if it's a great Boeing 47, it needs a coffee maker and a bathroom and a cockpit. But none of those things is a Boeing 747. In fact, a Boeing 747 is, because of its 6 million parts, dependent in 6 million ways on things not itself to be itself. And I think this is why that becomes if we transfer that way of thinking into our theology, into our thought of God, then what we end up having is a multi-part, super complex God who also happens to be a extremely dependent being, just like a Boeing 747 is dependent on so many things, not itself. What we want to avoid, and I would say you could go to the person in the pew and get this response. If I were to ask the average Christian in the pew who's never taken a theology class in his life or her life, is God dependent on what is not God in order to be? That might seem like a weird way of putting the question, but I would say almost 10 times out of 10, they're going to say no. God does not depend on something not God in order to be. That's what we believe when we believe God is the absolute creator of heaven and earth, that all things, Romans 11:36, are from him, through him, and to him. If that's true, then God can't be made of parts, because we all understand that things composed of parts depend upon parts, not identical with what they are as a whole. And that's what we're really after with divine simplicity. What we're really saying when we talk about divine goodness, love, justice, and power, for instance, while the manifestation of goodness and love and justice and power may be variegated in the created order, we see those demonstrated in various different ways. Love demonstrated through redemption, power demonstrated through the parting of the Red Sea waters, or through burying the Egyptians in those Red Sea waters, so that justice and power and love and mercy can all show themselves in a variety of ways. What we need to be careful of doing is thinking that this variety of demonstration corresponds to a real variety of attributes within the divine being. And that's really what simplicity is concerned to say, that God isn't a complex entity cobbled together with a bit of love and a bit of justice and a bit of wisdom and a bit of power, and put all these wonderful bits together, and you get this great complex thing that we call Yahweh. Right. That's what we want to be careful, because Yahweh isn't the result of or the consequent of some bit of this and that and the other.
Well, briefly, this may be difficult, but for those, again, thinking, okay, this does seem like mainstream Christian orthodoxy. What is the alternative to this position? What's the opposite of divine simplicity? So in your books, you discuss mutualism, you discuss theistic personalism. Again, technical terms. Can you just briefly define those and say, yeah, but there is this other camp advocating this view?
Yeah, and let me define them in non-technical terms. I think the alternative to divine simplicity is a dependent deity. In the Bible, dependent deities are idols. They are things that receive their forms of being from others. Things composed of parts depend upon if you can think about it like this, back to parts and wholes. No whole is identical with its parts. For a part to be a part, it has to lack something that belongs to the whole. Otherwise, it would just be the whole. So having said that, a thing composed of parts is a dependent entity, a dependent thing. And in the Bible, dependent things that receive worship are the gods of the nations, or the idols that they fashion. And I think we need to be careful with this. If we say that God is composed of parts, then what we're positing is that God depends on what is not identical with himself in order to be. And then, of course, then it raises the whole question of what funds or what supplies these actualities of being to God. What accounts for his goodness or his love and justice if God is not identical with his goodness? So what I would say is that, using the title of the second book, all that is in God is God. In God, goodness just is God. In God, wisdom just is God. Whereas, like in you, if I could say if I said Scott is wise, Scott is wise, but Scott is a being that has wisdom. He's not you, Scott, are not identical with wisdom. Wisdom is something you have, but you sometimes, I'm going to take it, aren't wise, just like each of us, not named Jesus, are sometimes not wise. So that wisdom for you is not identical with what you are. It's just a feature of being that you have. You can acquire it and you can lose it. So that when I say Scott is wise, and let's just say that you have strength, let's just say you've been working out and running and you're strong, I can also talk about Scott's power, in which case being wise and being powerful aren't necessarily the same thing. You can be wise, but also also be weak in other respects, or you could be very strong and bench press 300 pounds, but be a fool.
So every morning he does.
Every morning, that's what you start to, just before your orange juice, 300 pounds, that's perfect. So, but you could do that, and then, and you could lack wisdom, you could lack justice, you could lack power, or of other sorts. So that in us, all these different names actually refer to different attributes or properties of our being. And what we really are is we are a kind of a complex of all these things together. So if you are, wise and strong and kind and human, I could say you are a wise, kind, strong man. I could say something like that, but not one of those terms, being a man, being wise, being strong, or being loving, are necessarily identical with the others. But in God, what we're saying is everything we say God is just his godness. God is the love. God doesn't have love. He is the love by which he is loving. God doesn't have power. He is the power by which he performs all of his mighty deeds. God doesn't have wisdom. He is his very nature, his divinity is the very wisdom by which he is wise. And that's kind of what we're after with divine simplicity. When you have divine complexity, you have a twofold problem. You have the problem of God depending on what is not identical with himself in order to be in some way. And then you have the second problem of unity. In other words, what accounts for the togetherness, what funds the unity of these parts, so that, if you went back to a Boeing 747 and you saw it flying through the sky, or you saw it sitting on the tarmac somewhere, you would rightly conclude that all those 6 million parts put together in just such a right arrangement to produce this powerful flying machine were in fact parts that were assembled together by someone that imposed unity upon those. So you'd go to the Boeing factory in Western Washington, and you'd go and you'd actually walk into a place where you have people imposing unity on parts. We call that an assembly line. Some power of unification has to account for the togetherness of the parts in any composite entity. And I think this is the alternative to simplicity. It really is a deity that is doubly dependent on parts not identical with itself, and dependent on whatever funds the unity that those parts happen to have. And as far as sort of modern alternatives, I don't think, this is my own read on it, I don't think that modern evangelicals who tend to talk this way about God are fully aware of the implications of what they're doing. In other words, I'm not ready to say that this is some kind of high-handed, malicious undermining of the absoluteness of God. I think it's just sort of, and if it just happens that way.
Right. And if I could cut in real quick as you're hitting on that, modern evangelicals, you're talking about people that would say, for instance, well, yes, God is simple and undivided, all these sorts of things according to his divine nature, but then he also created history. And because he created history, then maybe in another sense, he's in time, and maybe he's experiencing time with us, and there's change in God. And, in one minute he's loving towards someone, another minute he's not loving towards someone. Or you have the passage in Genesis where he regretted that he had made man prior to the flood, right? Those sorts of things. Some people will try to argue like, yes, simplicity, but also, there's this, complexity here. As far as God's emotions, his passions, maybe he's mutable in a sense, even though he's immutable and unchangeable. But you would say, nice try, but no.
That's what I would say. And I think, and this is why I would say that the problem, there is the challenge of what to do with the ordinary language of the Bible. When it says that God was grieved in his heart, or when it says that God came down, or when it talks about God perceiving things as if his knowledge is derived from observation. In other words, as if his knowledge isn't really independent, but his knowledge is dependent on things. What do we do with that language? You really have two options if you're going to believe what the Bible says. You can either believe that language is language speaking to us in an accommodated fashion, sort of like the way we interpret the language of the Bible with regard to body parts and functions. So just like when the Bible talks about God's nostrils being inflamed, or 3 times it talks about his bowels being upset. So just like we don't attribute sort of divine indigestion and sore noses to God, even though the Bible talks that way, we understand that the Bible is using an imagery and a language that isn't literally proper to the divine being, but still it is a non-literal way of conveying something true. That God morally approves of people, and their moral condition is translated into the terms of soothing aromas entering his nostrils. Okay, so we understand that God doesn't have an olfactory sense because he doesn't have a body, and he doesn't smell burning meat and say, "That smells nice. I'm going to let these people live." These are all the rituals of men, but there is a correspondence to God's moral and religious acceptance of his people, and it's delivered to us in an imagery that is not literal. So with regard to like the grief in his heart and the learning through perception, we can say, is this perhaps another instance of the Bible using an accommodated sort of anthropomorphic form of communication that is denoting something true, even though the mode of revelation isn't true? Like God doesn't have nostrils, but he does really morally approve of his people who offer sacrifices from their heart. Should we do that? And I would say that's what we should do with all the language suggesting change or dependency in the divine being. We should read that language as a kind of accommodated, non-literal fashion. The other alternative is to posit a kind of second way of being for God, almost a kind of shadow deity in a way, I'm afraid, in which God exists. It's not that he exists in one way, but reveals himself in a temporally accommodated anthropomorphic way. It's that, in fact, that language of the Bible literally corresponds to another manner of divine being itself. The problem I have with this is if you're going to say he's simple in one respect and he's not in another, you're going to have some kind of
That's not simple.
That's not simple. Because what you end up having is God and his double mode of being, the simple mode, the complex mode, the immutable mode, the mutable mode, and that mutability, that dependency has to be. If you're going to say it's literally true of the divine being, you're going to have to locate it somewhere. Are you going to locate it in the nature and the essence of God, or are you going to generate a kind of a second manner of being? But then you have God who's complex. Now he's composite of his simple part and his composite part. So it ends up multiplying the problems, I think.
Well, there's a lot to get into here. We're going to dive into the practical implications of who God is, why it matters for missions. We're going to do that in just a moment with Dr. James Dolezal after this break. Cross Conference 2020 is coming. This December, gather a group of 18 to 25-year-olds in your living room or church auditorium and join the Cross 20 live stream. Your group will hear from David Platt, Tripp Lee, John Piper, and others as they aim to emphasize the clarity of the gospel, the centrality of the local church, and God's heart for the nations. Registration is just $10 per person. You can learn more and register at cross20.com. Learn more again and register at cross20.com.
Hi, I'm Scott Dunford, and I'd like to share with you about a new nonprofit ministry established to help churches, Christian schools, and other ministries protect children and prevent abuse. Rich Hemar from Church Law and Tax states that the number one reason that drives churches to court is child sexual abuse. I can't think of anything more devastating to these lives, their families, and our witness before a watching world than sexual abuse that takes place in ministry. The traumatic impact often leaves the vulnerable not wanting anything to do with God or his people. Our efforts toward evangelism, discipleship, and spiritual formation are not only neutralized, but shattered. Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention was formed to help ministry leaders understand the complexities of child protection and abuse prevention. They are establishing standards and an accreditation program that will help verify that appropriate measures are in place at your church or ministry. Learn more about them. Find a helpful and free assessment tool to help you see how you measure up in this area. Go to abuseprevention.org and click on the link for this resource assessment. Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention.
And this June, attend the national conference. Go to abuseprevention.org and register with ABWE21 as the promo code to receive 20% off your ticket. That's promo code ABWE21 to receive 20% off. Brooks Buser, president of Radius International.
I am here with Mark Dever, senior pastor at Capitol Hill Baptist and president of 9 Marks.
When you go to a culture that's a different language than yours, you're ending up in a kind of majority language that's been reached. And there are other peoples still more hidden, and it's those people who are often almost entirely unreached, and they take more cross-cultural effort. Is there a way we can better train people to have more realistic expectations of what life is like in the kind of 2 steps away from my culture, and be able to sustain family life with its normal difficulties there, so that there can be a long years and even decades long witness in that culture? And it seems like Radius is set up to provide that training. Radius is about reaching unreached people groups.
Go to radiusinternational.org, radiusinternational.org.
And we're back with Dr. James Dolezal talking about the doctrine of God, God's simplicity, and what it means for missions. Boy, we've gotten into a lot here. My brain is full already. We do want to bring this into the realm of practicality, especially as it comes to cross-cultural ministry. But just to kind of wrap up some things, God is simple. He's undivided. He has no parts. He's not composed of parts. The Trinity is not different parts of God. God is one unified essence. And, I think one major danger in theology is something that was controversial a number of years ago. Perhaps some of that controversy's died away now. Open theism or process theology, openness theology, but this idea that God is partially or maybe entirely experiencing time with us, is learning alongside of us. He knows all the potential outcomes in the future. He's like Doctor Strange, right? In the Avengers films, looking at all, 7 million aspects of the future and possible outcomes. And he's calculating the exact best way that things should go according to plan. But he's not like that at all. Just a side note, there's a prominent missiological text where one of the writers for that is Greg Boyd, who's a prominent open theist. If you've read the Perspectives Reader, you've read an open theist. So these are things that need to be discussed out in the open, and we need to make sure that in the realm of missions, we're diving deep into some of these concepts. It doesn't sound controversial until you bring it into contrast with some of the things that are being taught oftentimes. But Scott, maybe you have a question. I think there's part of this relates to the Trinity and the way that motivates missions too.
Sure. And I think that you started touching on the Trinity, and I think that's where probably a lot of my questions would come in, how this all plays together with the 3-in-1-ness of God, of a God without parts. And yet we understand the distinctiveness of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. But relating that to missions, there's a lot of talk about the Trinitarian aspect of the Missio Dei, where it's Father, Son, and Spirit working together to accomplish God's mission in the world. And maybe even though, as I'm saying that, I'm pausing, you're hearing pause in my voice going like, okay, I hope I'm not violating this divine simplicity even as I'm talking about this. But so we talk about the Missio Dei flowing from the Trinity itself. Does this imply motion or even change? Because we do see, this movement of God to reach the nations and to spread his knowledge across the world. Does this show some kind of difference or change? How do you explain the Missio Dei in this context of divine simplicity?
That's a good question, and I think I think the 2 things we want to lay down first, and I think Alex said the first part of this, that when we talk about the Trinity, particularly when we bring the Christian faith into a Jewish or Islamic context in which we're facing other monotheists, we want to be careful not to present the Trinity as as a three-partedness, one part Father, one part Son, one part Spirit. As I say, shake well, and lo and behold, deity. We don't want to think of it as a three-parted concoction. We also want to be careful not to multiply the divine substance and end up in something like tritheism. So we have to be able to articulate the Trinity that does a good job of heading off tripartitism on the one side. That would be multipartedness, which we have to deny, and tritheism on the other side, which is just a kind of modest version of polytheism. And divine simplicity, I think, is sort of at the heart of this, why we can't do either of those. We can't multiply the divine substance and we can't partition the divine substance. So what do we say with regard to the three persons? How do we distinguish? This is the key. And this is, I think, one of the greatest demands for a Christian theology is distinguishing the persons of God in such a way that the distinctions are real, that the Father is not the Son and is not the Spirit, and so on for the other two persons, that they are not, that there's a real distinction with the other two, and yet does so in such a way that doesn't imply that they are more basic constituents or parts of God, or that they are three gods. There are three who are God, but not three gods. Christians' simplicity is really driving that desire. How do we articulate the distinctions? Very briefly, historically, the way that's done is through what we call relations of origin or processions within the Godhead. And the procession of the Son is that eternal generation or begottenness of the Son from the Father, a begottenness that does not partition the divine nature. This is a little different. I have 3 children, and there was a partitioning of my physical substance and my wife's in the production of offspring, so that I really did undergo division of parts in the production of offspring. We have to talk about an eternal generation that is not a division within the Godhead, a going forth or a procession that does not result in a being outside of God. We call that creation. The going forth of things from God that terminate or end up in non-divine beings, or what we call creatures. What we're talking about with the Son is a going forth, an eternal generating that results in a person who is not a creature. So that this divine person who is generated actually exists within the self-same divine being as the Father. The distinction is in that relationship of procession. The same for the Spirit, as proceeding from the Father and the Son. Sometimes I tell my students, what God is eternally is just the Father begetting the Son, and together with the Son breathing forth the Spirit from all eternity in a timeless act of perfect, undivided being. Nevertheless, those persons are distinct because of those relations. Well, now to the question of missions, and to draw this together is really takes a great deal of work, but I'll try to simplify it.
Thank you.
Well, go ahead. Okay, yeah, I will. The key word there is try. I think what we should say with regard to, and let's just talk about the mission of God first and foremost with regard to the incarnation of the Son and the pouring forth of the Spirit at Pentecost. These sort of, and I think it's right to use mission language to describe the Son's going forth and also the Spirit's being sent by the Father and by the Son in the work of redemption. This redemptive mission of the Son and this redemptive mission of the Spirit. What I want to argue is that these historic goings forth, the Son in the fullness of time, born of a virgin under the law to redeem those who are under the law, and the Spirit being poured forth, the Spirit of the Father being poured forth by the Son on his people, drawing them into fellowship with himself and giving them access to the Father, that what these redemptive historical events are, incarnation and Pentecost, are, if I could put it like this, historic, time-bound, temporal manifestations of an eternal generation and an eternal procession of the Spirit, so that the Son's going forth in time is like the eternal going forth of the Son now being translated into and I will call this an immutable going forth gets translated into a mutable one. A timeless going forth gets translated into a temporal going forth. And I have one key verse I like for this, and it's one that
always good to have at least one.
At least one, and hopefully I should have more than this. But this one I like, especially around Advent season. Micah 5:2, where he says, "Blessed are you, Bethlehem Ephratah, too little to be among the clans of Judah." Then he gets into this whole issue of mission, of going forth. He says, "From you, one will go forth for me to be a ruler in Israel." And he's clearly talking about the advent of the Messiah who's going to go forth. He's going to go forth on mission from God to be a ruler in Israel and to effect the promised salvation. But then the text goes on. It says, and this is kind of weird language, it says his goings forth, which is kind of plural. It's plural language. His goings forth are from of old, from days of eternity. And there's this idea that this one who will proceed from God in the fullness of time from Bethlehem is in fact one who has outside of time from all of eternity proceeded from God. And what I think what you have a temporal redemptive historical mission that is in a certain sense a redemptively inflected translation of an eternal intra-divine procession. So that the eternal generation of the Son is in a certain sense translated into redemptive historical reality in the temporal going forth of the Son at Christmas.
So can I hop on that real quick then? For people, it may be a new thought that the Missio Dei, the mission of God, is the overflow of the relations within the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that there are these relationships here, and that pours out into God's love and mission for the world. But what you're saying is, yes, that's true. But what we can't do then is read that back onto the nature of God. So Jesus says to his disciples, just as I've been sent, so I'm sending you. What we can't do is then say like, yeah, God sends us out on mission. And that's all that's going on in the relationship between Father and Son. There's much more to it than that. It's reflection of that. So yes, missions comes from the relations inside of the Trinity. The Father's love for the Son, the Father's sending of the Son, and the Father's breathing out of the Spirit, and the Son's breathing out of the Spirit together with him. But there's something deeper there too that none of our metaphorical language can even get at. Is that fairly accurate?
Yeah. So let me just drop this on you. There's a profound modal incommensurability. Yes, those are the words I meant to choose. Modal incommensurability.
Okay. Oh, now it's clear.
Yes. Oh, and now everything, all the myths have gone lost. And this perfect luminosity has dawned. Yeah. No, but what I mean by that is the manner of procession within the Godhead is in many respects different than the manner of the procession of the Son in the assumption of human flesh, in as much as there is no time element in it. There is no material element in it. There is no spatial element in it, like Bethlehem as opposed to like Jerusalem. So that a lot of the historical and created and finite characteristics that characterize the going forth of the Son in the fullness of time through the assumption of flesh, being conceived by the Virgin and being born of her, all the modalities of that mission are in fact the modalities of creation itself. But it's a if I can put it like this, think of creation as a kind of refraction into time and space of eternal undifferentiated reality, eternal realities being translated into an historic copy, so that you have a non-historic going forth of the Son and the Godhead that's translated into an historic going forth of the Son in the fullness of time. You have an immaterial going forth of the Son and the Godhead that's translated into the going forth of the Son who took on flesh. Does that make sense? So that this going forth from Bethlehem really is a copy in time and space, with all the modalities of creatureliness attached to it, of a non-temporal eternal procession in the Godhead. God is revealing his triunity in the mission of the Son and of the Spirit. Yeah. The going forth of the Son and the Spirit are a kind of redemptive historical translation of an eternal, non-historical reality.
So God is a missionary God. He's simple, yes, but he's still a missionary God. That's huge, right, Scott?
I think so. I think that's beautiful. And, I hope our listeners, we know there's a lot of listeners that don't have a lot of formal theological training, and some that do, that are still finding their minds spinning. Like we do recognize that sometimes we're pushing, you're pushing me, you're pushing Alex, I know, and I know we're pushing our listeners, but this also can cause us to let's take a step and study some things that we haven't really thought of before to help us be better in the task that God has called us to in our missions work. So I want to kind of tie that into a practical side of missionary work, in the sense of, a Hindu hears us talk about the Godhead and they go, oh yeah, that makes sense to me. But they interpret it polytheistically, right?
Right.
And a Muslim hears what we're saying and go like, you can't be truly a monotheist because there's Father, Son, and Spirit. That sounds like three gods, not one God, and they reject it. So help our missionaries to understand, or help me even to understand, how might this discussion and a deeper study and even an explanation of the simplicity of the divine being of God Himself, how might that help missionaries that are trying to explain who God is to people who have very foreign concepts of God?
I think I'll answer first with regard to the kind of either pantheistic or polytheistic context that a missionary might go into. What those systems of religion and what those theisms lack is they lack an absolute cause of all things. In other words, every one of those deities, insofar as they are composed of parts, insofar as they are passionate and mutable deities who can be moved and changed by the operations of others upon them, since those gods like that could not really be the self-sufficient reason for their own being, because being composed of parts, they would be dependent entities. What divine simplicity gives you is it gives you the message of a God who is the absolute creator of heaven and earth, the one from whom and through whom and to whom are all things, in whom we live, move, and have our being. And I think what divine simplicity enables you to do, if rightly understood, is it enables you to contrast the true God of absolute creation, who upholds all things by the word of His power, to contrast a God like that from the self-insufficiency of the gods that they worship. And what simplicity does is it exposes the hollowness and the vanity of the gods of the nations as being really unworthy objects of trust and devotion, because ultimately all of these deities, insofar as they are composite deities, are entities either of your own imagination or demons. These are entities that themselves are dependent for their being. They aren't self-sufficient unto themselves. But when we say that all that is in God is God, and that God just is His own act of existing, we actually have a message about the God of absolute creation. And this is when I think of like Paul confronting the pagans, it's often this idea of absolute creatorhood and sourcehood that he's emphasizing. Well, simplicity is just a way of guarding and preserving that absoluteness of the creator of all things. So I think for polytheists, simplicity plays that role of if your God is not simple, then your God cannot be the absolute first cause of all things, because your God Himself is caused, to put it something like that, say it like that. I think with regard to Islam, the main concern is that we're going to have to be able to articulate triunity in a way that does not end up becoming tritheism, which of course is their concern. And they're not, Muslims are not wrong to be concerned with tritheism, because tritheism's false. So it's not, let's grant that much. But what we need to do then is articulate a doctrine of the Trinity that does not make each of the persons a part or portion of the Godhead on the one hand, or make each of the persons a distinct God on the other hand. And I think that divine simplicity would actually enable us to speak about distinctions that aren't distinctions of parts, distinctions of persons, but not distinctions of of parts of being. So I think in that respect, there's a lot of promise in this doctrine for confronting Islam as well. But what we're going to have to show is that whatever distinguishes the persons, it doesn't distinguish them into three separate beings or distinguish them into three parts of one being.
I want to put a bookmark in that one, because that would be a great conversation to come back to and dive into that a lot more deeply. But anyway, go ahead, Alex.
Yeah. No, that is true. We could do an entire episode on that. And something else too that I've seen, we've had the blessing of watching missionaries go off to European contexts, places where there's maybe a strong secularist mindset that has really just calcified a lot of hearts and minds. And I've seen some very well-meaning but idealistic missionaries go there with not a strong understanding of just the central doctrines of theology proper, right? Who God is in his essence, in his being, and going in with this sense of I just want to love people. God is love, and I want to have relationships. Again, all very good things. And maybe as I'm describing that, the type of person. What I want to see though is that I want to make sure that those people are not devoured alive by a culture of skepticism that knows how to just destroy, an emotionalized picture of God that we have as Americans. The Jesus is my boyfriend picture of Americans that we have in our worship songs. So knowing that God is who he is, that he's self-sufficient, that he needs nothing from anybody, that he is altogether everything that he needs in himself. That is a powerful picture. And that, I think, needs to be brought to bear, not just on the pagan and idolatrous cultures or on the non-Christian religious cultures of the world, but then also on the secularist cultures too, Scott.
Yeah. So how does understanding that idea that God needs nothing, or, to use a bigger, not a bigger word, but a fancier word, aseity, how does understanding that about God, that he doesn't need us even, help correct some faulty motivations that people might have in missions? We hear that a lot, like God needs you to do this, and, God wants to reach them, but if only you'll go, kind of motivation, which does play on us for sure. So how can this understanding help create right motivations in missions?
Well, let me give a twofold response. First, to the secular one. I think what simplicity and a doctrine like aseity, or God's of himselfness, does is it actually gives the missionary the tools to be skeptical of skepticism, to really interrogate and lay bare the hollowness of skepticism, and to expose skepticism as really an unwillingness to ask the questions about why there is a world at all. Because when you ask the question why there is a world, you ultimately come to something that has to be the reason for itself, and only a simple God could be that reason. So that if you have a firm grasp of simplicity, you'll understand actually how secular skepticism is in fact an abdication of human curiosity, and it will give you the tools to stir up that curiosity of why there is anything at all and what could account for it, and how physics will never answer that question, because physics itself needs a cause of its being. Simplicity will give you the ammunition to stir up the secularist from his dogmatic slumbers. To the second point about needing us, I think what it does, especially for each of us, whether we are on the foreign mission field or just simply fulfilling the calling of the Great Commission in our own neighborhood, is it's a profound reminder that we are but free instruments of the Almighty, that he condescends and is pleased to use us as means to an end, but that because he is in no way lacking in being, because he's fullness of being itself, because he's infinite plenitude of being, because there's no good lacking in him, that whatever our instrumental role is in his purposes for the nations and in redemption and the proclamation of the gospel, that ours is but the role of instruments and tools in his hands. And I think it takes a lot of burden off of us, actually, if we realize that the efficacy and the outcome and the success of this mission doesn't ultimately lie with me. I'm just the tool that God is pleased to use for this time, because this is it's his good pleasure to use human instruments to tell his glory to the nations, but that he will get glory for himself. And my inadequacies or whatever they may be are not something that are inhibiting God or depriving him of achieving his purposes. I think that gives a real sense of freedom and confidence to each of us.
Amen. Yeah, I think of Psalm 50, right? If I were hungry, I wouldn't tell you. I don't need your sacrifices.
Right.
I'm not hungry, right? I don't need a steak. This is about you being grateful to me, right? Offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving. And that'll preach, because as we wrap up here, the missionary task is hard. It's hard. And without a big God anchoring your theology, how are you going to sustain yourself in ministry for decades, right? If you have a small God who's, I'm sorry, there's this commercial that I used to see on cable TV for years. Maybe they still run it, but it's got this cheesy jingle and it's got a cartoon. And I don't know if the Foundation for a Better Life or something like that put it out. I have no idea, but it's like, we need more of God's love so we can love one another. And it all sounds great. And literally it's a cartoon of like, there's this hand from heaven just throwing hearts down on earth. And then everyone is just like throwing hearts around and tossing hearts. And you see just everyone come alive, and it goes from black and white to color. And it's all so inspiring. But it's very small. And if the picture of God that we have just throwing hearts down on creation, not to make light of God's love for the world, because boy, we'll spend an eternity wrapping our minds around the love of God. But if we conceive of that in a small way, without having first who God is anchored in our minds, then the fact that this God loves us isn't going to do anything for us. We need to know who God is in his nature if we're going to be engaged in the missionary task. So wrapping up now, James, how can people get a hold of you?
They could find me at Cairn University's website, cairn.edu. I'm on the faculty page of the School of Divinity, and books should be available online, Amazon, elsewhere.
All right. Well, James, Dr. Dolezal, we are so glad that you're able to join us today. If you have questions for us, send them to alex@missionspodcast.com. And before you leave, smash the subscribe button. Make sure you leave us a positive rating and review in your favorite podcast app. You can get more at abwe.org/podcast or missionspodcast.com. And until next week, thank you for listening.